Hello, I'm Shona Jenkins and welcome to this discussion of Britain after Boris Johnson. It's been an extraordinary fortnight in British politics. After months of scandal and controversy over Boris Johnson's leadership, the Conservative Parliamentary Party finally had enough and forced the Prime Minister to resign, setting off a fierce struggle to replace him. 11 MPs initially stood, and by next week there will be a shortlist of just 2. Then the party's membership will vote to choose the UK's next leader, who will be announced on September 5th. What this contest has shown is that the Tory party remains split between pragmatists looking to change the chaotic politics of the Johnson years and those who want to continue with his populist style. All this comes against a backdrop of deepening economic gloom, with the UK suffering its worst cost of living crisis in decades, with alarming levels of poverty. Inflation is predicted to rise to 11% by the autumn, energy prices are soaring, and hundreds of thousands of workers are threatening to go on strike. With me in the studio to discuss how the leadership battle could affect all this are the FT's George Parker, Stephen Bush, Peter Foster, and the CBI's Saima Kalassi-Aldrich. Now, we'd love to hear your questions too. You can submit them through the box on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you want to widen the discussion on social media, you can use the hashtag #FTBritainAfterBoris. Now, George, what will Boris Johnson do with his remaining time in office?
Well, the convention says not very much, but of course Boris Johnson isn't always bound by convention, as we know. But essentially, he's able to carry on running the business of government. He's promised he won't do novel or unusual things. That would certainly, I think, trigger a backlash from the cabinet. But he will carry on with the business of government, taking key decisions. One of the big decisions that he has to take next week, for example, is on public sector pay, which is going to be one of the most consequential decisions on the economy. You know, is he going to give them an above sort of, I suspect, a pay rise of around about 4 or 5%. But that's the kind of big decision you have to take. The heat wave, for example, will you have to exercise emergency responses to that. So the whole load of business of government things which will carry on. But in the end, he will be gone by September the 5th. Parliament isn't sitting over the summer holidays, which starts on Thursday for MPs. So there's a limit really to what he can do.
Saima, I just wanted to ask you, if we looking at Boris Johnson, what will his legacy be, do you think, for business in the UK?
So I think there's a couple of really good examples of where business and government worked really closely together over the Boris Johnson era. So furlough, for example, vaccine rollout was brilliant, and that was hand in hand, business every day, every hour working. You know, I was talking to one of the pharmaceutical chiefs the other day, and she was saying how they knew where each box was at each minute, right? And they worked with government on where each thing was and getting that out. And that is a really good example of when crisis response, business and government working together. So that's one of the positives that's come out of this. And I guess if you were asking me about what I would want the next government to do, is work with business really, really closely, so we can make sure that in this really tricky time, they hit the ground running with policy that is immediately actionable.
Right. And if we shift to the campaign itself, there's been a lot of vitriol, shall we say, in the last few days. What has it revealed about the Tory party itself? And if I can ask you to take a slight punt, George, you know, who do you think is going to make the final cut?
Well, thanks for that.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, look, I mean, I think the Spectator magazine's front cover sums it up quite well this week. It says "Blue Murder." I mean, it's become quite a vicious campaign. Lots of very negative briefings. It's a very open race as well. I mean, I don't think sitting here today we can be absolutely certain who is going to be on the shortlist of 2, which goes out to the members over the summer. But at the moment, it looks like Rishi Sunak probably will, the former Chancellor now, and then a race between Penny Mordaunt and Liz Truss for that second name on the ballot. But you can't rule out a late run from Kemi Badenoch, who came fourth in the second round of voting on Thursday. Equally, it's an outside possibility that Rishi Sunak slips up at the last stage next week and doesn't end up on the ticket at all, and you end up with Mordaunt versus Truss. I think that's an unlikely scenario. Look, all the polls suggest that if Sunak is in the last 2, then all the other candidates would beat Sunak because the party members typically are to the right. They think that Sunak is associated with higher taxes for being disloyal to Boris Johnson. Again, I'm not sure if that's necessarily going to be borne out by what happens in reality, because yes, the easy thing for the Tory membership to do is go for the most right-wing candidate offering the sugar rush of immediate tax cuts. But we are facing an economic crisis. And I think the more they see of the candidates, regardless of whether you think Rishi Sunak is a bit too slick, you certainly know that he's someone who's got experience in high office running the Treasury for the last couple of years. So if you're asking me to put a punt on it, I would think Sunak versus Truss in the last two, and I think 50-50 then on who wins it.
Stephen, I'll ask you to do the same thing, but I also wanted to ask if you thought that this kind of toxicity that we're seeing on show, I guess leadership contests are always slightly cutthroat, but there's some nastiness around. Do you think the party can heal itself before the next election, I suppose, is the question?
No, because I think the reason why this race is so toxic is precisely that it's really hard to predict who's going to come, who's going to come first, second, and third. And obviously, the first and second are the two golden tickets available. And one product of that closeness is whatever happens, the winning candidate will only have the support of about a third of the parliamentary party. So it's going to be very hard, and they will almost certainly have promised a number of irreconcilable things. It's going to be very hard for them to turn around to the other 2/3 and go, I have a strong mandate, you need to unify behind me. So I think this toxicity and division, paralysis is the one guaranteed winner of this leadership election.
And do you think, how does business see this? What do you do when you've got this kind of, it's not quite suspended animation, as George said, there is some policy, there are some decisions that will be taken, but it is a bit of stasis. How do you view that?
I think that is, stasis is a concern to business, right? Uncertainty is the enemy of investment. What we need right now is business investment. So, I would suggest to government that they continue to make sure they are taking action that they are able to take over the summer. Don't stop, don't pause. There are things that they can be doing, but also for the new candidates to hit the ground running. One thing that I think is really encouraging about this race is that growth is back on the table. They are fighting a contest. They're all talking about what their growth plans are. They've all got different ways of doing it, but they're all talking about it, and that is great. What they will need to do as soon as they get in, though, is we're going to have a budget pretty quickly, right? That's not going to be able to wait given the economic climate. And what that will need to be is policy that works in boardrooms and is deliverable in boardrooms, as well as just sounding good at the dispatch box.
Just before we move over to economic questions, which I think is at the heart of most of our readers or our viewers have been asking questions around this, I just wanted to ask about Boris Johnson and the opposition. For Keir Starmer, he was a bit of a gift. Starmer was able to portray himself as a sort of sober managerial type, and Boris Johnson was, the opposite. With him gone, is this an opportunity or is it bad? What do you think, Stephen?
I think it's pretty much always a bad thing if your enemy is weak anywhere and they strengthen, and whoever emerges will start with a higher popularity rating than Boris Johnson. But also in terms of the contrast Keir Starmer has drawn, it's one thing being sort of dull and reliable when your opponent is a bit too exciting. If your opponent is Rishi Sunak, aren't you just, dull?
Well, we'll see. Right. So I wanted to just move on to segue into the economy. The House of Commons Treasury Committee this week accused ministers of a lack of long-term thinking in economic strategy. There are fears that the UK could be heading for recession. I wanted to ask Peter, well, if you're okay with this, one of our readers has asked, why would rapid implementation of tax cutting make sense in terms of driving UK growth? This is one of the growth.
Am I allowed to answer that it wouldn't necessarily? It is one of those policies, I think, which is obviously a kind of almost an article of faith in the slightly simplest Tory narrative. Margaret Thatcher cut taxes, which she did towards the end, 88, I think, with the big tax cuts, not at the beginning, right? It's an important thing to remember. But there is a kind of simplest narrative around cutting taxes to make growth. That, if you cut taxes, you end up getting more back in growth. It's not actually always the case. And I think what we actually need is a kind of fact-based approach to politics, which is incredibly difficult in that environment where whoever wins only gets 1/3 of the only has support of 1/3 of the party. Because what we've seen, Simon's very polite really about the way the government's dealt with business, but actually what we've seen over the last 2-3 years is a government that did a trade deal with Europe, our biggest trade partner by far, that wasn't in the interest of industry or business at all. This is the Prime Minister, remember, who said, F business, who didn't listen to business last October when they were coming forward saying, we need help on immigration, we need help on shortage of occupation. This week, British Chambers of Commerce, and I think the CBI as well, saying we need to fix the shortage of occupation. We don't have enough people to open cafes, to grow our businesses. I can't hire a forklift truck driver. What we need if we want to get back to growth, is encouragement for business to invest, because we're at the bottom of the league tables in investing, and then a sort of stable. Simon makes the point about regulatory certainty, a stable, non-febrile environment. And, my colleague on the political bench here don't fill me with confidence, frankly, that that's what we're going to get, whoever wins this beauty contest.
Yeah, the shortage occupation list is a really good example of something that you don't need a stasis government. They can take action on that before a new government comes in, and that would actually have a real impact on workforce pressures. But going back to the point on growth and what we need in order to grow the economy, it's also important to see the context that we're in, right? Household recession is already here. There's a real cost of living crisis. People are worrying about the pounds in their pockets, and that's not going to get any better. We're in a period of high inflation as well, and that is all looking pretty, I don't want to use the word bleak, but it's hard, right? And what our surveys, our economic surveys are showing is that one of the only things that's stopping a deeper downturn is business investment. So if I had a plea to that new budget that's coming in, is you have targeted support to the people who really, really need it, because general cuts don't actually help the people who need it the most. You need targeted support in order to do that. And you incentivize business investment. The super deduction is running out next year. And that is a really good example of where you can have a permanent successor to the super deduction. And we talked about those boardrooms around the country making decisions about global investments. Business don't just look at one thing. They look at an overall picture. They don't look at headline rates. They look at what the overall investment environment looks like and what the political environment looks like. Those are things that impact business decisions. And so an incoming government can actually, inject a bit of positivity into the economy by taking some action on business investment. You're right, the business investment is lower than where it should be, but it doesn't need to be like that.
Inevitably, the debate on taxation is taking place in the context of a Tory leadership contest and appealing to, first of all, 358 Tory MPs and then 150,000 odd Tory members rather than business. But some of the debate is frankly completely out of touch with what business wants and needs. Good example being the pledge by a number of candidates to reverse the rise in the headline rate of corporation tax from 19% to 25% next year. When Sunak announced that, you'll agree with this, business didn't kick up a huge fuss, because the key thing is to actually help give incentives to businesses to invest and innovate. And if you're a big company making profits, well, that's a pretty good thing. They are not your priority areas at a time like this. If you've got £17 billion to throw around, that is probably not where you would put it.
Yeah, and also general tax cuts are expensive, right?
Yeah.
It's actually about how you bring in more money into the economy through investment.
Sorry, I was just going to say one of our viewers has asked a question, which Stephen and George, you can fight over. Is when did the party of low tax become the party of achievable fantasy tax promises? So what is it about the culture that has made this? In a way, it's a kind of race to the bottom. Could I say a race to the bottom? I'm not sure, but how would you?
So I think in some ways it's actually a decline in three acts, right? So in 2015, the Conservatives ran on a platform that they knew, in terms of the balance of spending cuts and tax rises, could not be delivered. And when George Osborne was asked about this by one of his then coalition partners from the Liberal Democrats, how do you make the sums add up? He went, well, don't worry, you'll make the sums add up for me in coalition negotiations. Then, of course, they won. They had a manifesto which it turned out, of course, couldn't be delivered. I think one of the reasons why that government very rapidly ran into trouble was the difficulty of delivering those cuts on that timetable. Then, of course, you have a Brexit campaign in which many of the claims were, shall we say, impressionistic. And then in order to get past the deadlock in 2019, the Conservatives had to make promises on taxes which couldn't be reconciled. They don't like those promises on tax and spending. And now we're essentially seeing the kind of reaction against all of that.
And I think the other thing is that one of Boris Johnson's legacies, apart from Brexit, is the fact that he took the Conservative Party into northern seats with an implicit promise of higher public spending to level up. So you've ended up now with a fragile coalition of Tory support where you've got people in the north expecting higher levels of public spending and Conservative voters in the south wanting lower taxation. And the two...
But the trouble is that structurally in the economy, it's all, what that's come down to is the Community Renewal Fund, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, essentially just dollops of money being given out, and actually in a not very efficient way. They're a nightmare to bid for. Half the time the bidding process doesn't work. dollops of money being given to these areas that need development. That's not levelling up. Levelling up has to be about getting northern urban areas to match what we see in the southeast in terms of productivity, and that requires investment. All the things that Simon talks about, not just doshing money up throwing money up north. It's kind of
there's a way of thinking about it as clarity of mission. You could put clarity of mission as something that the future government needs to think about. I don't care whether you call it an industrial strategy or seize the moment or a 10-point plan or whatever it is. It's clarity of mission, and that's when you bring in that. It's not just putting money into things, it's having policy that is going to be delivered to back it up. And that could be, regional clusters. It could be, how do you replicate the Oxford Cambridge ARC stuff elsewhere in the country? That's what it is. It needs to have that clarity of mission that underpins business investment.
How will that, given the candidates that we think will make, or you think will make, the sort of shortlist, is that likely or not likely to happen, this clarity of mission?
I think it's unlikely, not least that either Rishi Sunak will be defeated by someone promising something which cannot be delivered, or I think for him to win, he will have to promise some things which aren't deliverable himself. Right? He is either going to have to bend towards Penny Mordaunt and Liz Truss, or he's going to be broken by them. And so it means that any prospect that new leader will be able to offer that level of mission focus, particularly as the election will be coming up, and that will also make people panicked. I think it's very unlikely.
I think Stephen's right. Sunak will have to move on that and start to make unrealistic promises. But on the dull nitty gritty of it, I think if you want to have a look ahead to a Rishi Sunak budget, or a budget delivered by whoever Rishi Sunak's chancellor might be, you have to go back to the speech Sunak gave them, the May's economic lecture, which basically has the blueprint for an autumn budget in it. It's all about innovation, investment, as Simon was saying,
people, capital and ideas.
Yeah, replacing the super deduction with something else, but focusing relief onto areas which are going to bring our growth rates up, which obviously, as we know, is pretty pitiful. Investment levels are very low. Piece has written about this extensively. One of the reasons investment is so low is it's dropped off a cliff since 2016.
We're going to park Brexit for just a minute, because we are going to come to that, because this is one of the biggest questions that all of the viewers have been asking. But I just wanted to come back to the tax cut promises for a moment, because one of our viewers has just asked, what will tax cuts mean to the markets? Is anyone here, is anyone confident to answer that? And borrowing, I suppose, as well. Is that a big worry? Is that a big worry for business?
I was worried you were going to.
Yeah, sorry.
We don't have an economist here. So I think where I would go to is confidence breeds investment, and investment breeds growth. And there are loads of things that impact confidence. And confidence is a really good word to use here, because whether that's consumer confidence spending, business investment confidence, or confidence in governments, or whatever it might be, confidence is key here. Confidence is the thing that we need to underpin and unlock all of the stuff that we've been talking about.
One thing I would say on this is that if the next Prime Minister is either Penny Mordaunt or Liz Truss, there'll be a very early visit to Number 10 by Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England, to explain that, Prime Minister, I understand you want to cut taxes very quickly, but if you do that, the likelihood is that we'll have to put up interest rates more quickly than otherwise would have been the case. So,
and whatever your view about the candidates, Penny Mordaunt is, on paper, unbelievably inexperienced to go and be Prime Minister. At a time of immense crisis, I can't believe the markets are going to be filled with confidence by the sight of somebody who seems to have had two goes at ministerial jobs and failed at both of them. Well, I don't know if that's fair, but there's not a lot of experience there.
I mean, Penny Mordaunt's economic experience has been already attacked privately on off-the-record briefings by Rishi Sunak's people, and at her launch, I know this is a nerdy FT point, but she said, my monetary policy will be about controlling inflation, as if she was in charge of monetary policy rather than the Bank of England. So, I don't know.
Will this, if we have this, I how to put it politely, I mean, kind of economic illiteracy, I suppose, is part of it. If that is who becomes our next leader, what does that mean for the next 2 years, or until we have a next election? Are we likely to have? I mean, isn't that a bit terrifying? I don't know. Is this going to continue? I mean, can we just have this, or is there going to be? Will there be more infighting within the party that will also affect how they can govern?
Well,
whoever it is.
you would expect them to be able to, the new prime minister to be able to hold things together just about until the next election, which is probably what, 18 months, 2 years away. And there's a possibility that if you have this sort of sugar rush tax cuts, that the true economic implications don't feed through until after the election, but there will be a price to be paid. The interesting thing, I think, is the way that the Labour Party is now positioning itself as the party of economic responsibility. And that's a message, Simon will tell you this, that's been drummed home to business by Starmer, Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, Johnny Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary, and whole load. I gather it's not prawn cocktails anymore. It's guinea fowl, I'm told, is a guinea fowl offensive, apparently.
So in a sense, it's an opportunity for Labour. This could be a very big opportunity for Labour.
I think if it's a leader other than Rishi Sunak, then it's a possibility for the Labour Party to really sort of ram home what they hope will be seen as their new economic credentials out of the ashes of the Corbyn years.
I'd put another plug here for business and government working hand in hand, and business and economists and business and government and civil society and everybody. Kind of, when I was in government, I did that job. You make better policy when you don't make policy in a vacuum, and you make better decisions and you create a better investment environment when you're working with experts outside of government. So whoever gets in, that sounds like, based on what you're saying, something that they should be prioritising.
Okay, I think we have to turn to Brexit because that's what the majority of our readers love Brexit, and our viewers have been asking lots of questions about Brexit as well. The right of the party, it continues to be extremely focused on Brexit in a sense, but a discussion of its positives and its negatives, you wrote this, George, has become something of a taboo. I mean, you can't sort of look at it in a stand-back way. Well, actually, this works and this doesn't. How is this affecting the leadership race? Let's start with you, Stephen.
Well, in some ways, the weird thing is this is almost the first post-Brexit leadership race, because you have the situation in which you have David Frost making these continual, so former Boris Johnson advisor, now was making these continual critical interventions about how Rishi Sunak, a lifelong, essentially ideologically committed Brexiteer, is not as good a leaver as someone who voted to remain in quite strident terms as recently as 2016. Liz Truss, someone who said she didn't want her children to grow up in a post-Brexit world, is now apparently a good Brexiteer. But that move away from sort of Brexit being about how did you stand on whether or not we should be in the EU to it kind of being a vibes-based proposition has, as this brilliant piece George wrote, devolved into this conspiracy of silence about the fact that we concede that it's causing economic damage, we concede that it has limitations and consequences for government policy, but you're not allowed to talk about it and remain, an acceptable person in the Tory party, and the Labour Party is terrified they will turn to stone if they bring it up either.
Sorry.
Oh, God,
No. But what's so interesting is that David Frost, as you say, Remainer, is on record at the Scotch Whisky Association saying we'd be mad to leave the single market. Talks about who's going to save Brexit, who's going to defend Brexit, and when he's talking about that, he's talking about his own trade deal, and he's talking about defending this concept of complete regulatory autonomy, complete sovereignty. So what he's really saying is, don't elect Rishi Sunak. Don't have somebody who's going to kind of drag us back into the EU orbit, who might do a veterinary deal to reduce frictions at the border, who might fix the Northern Ireland Protocol so we can join Horizon Europe 2020, which we were supposed to be part of but are now cut out of, who might do a mobility chapter, who might do professional services agreement, right? In another world where we're not fighting with Europe over Northern Ireland. Now, it's quite an odd thing for, that wing of the Tory party that insisted that Frost did this very ultra hard, ultra minimalist deal in flying in the face of business, should somehow cling on to something which is visibly damaging the economic prospects of the country. But that's what's going on. And I think that's why, from an investor point of view, when you look at, the Truss, whatever Liz Truss used to think, right? I mean, Liz Truss's speech to the Food and Drink Federation in 2016, her articles that she wrote during the Leave campaign are eminently sensible. She's about to be elected leader of the Conservative Party, if she is, on an eminently Frostian, or whatever you want to call it, Brexit ticket. And I think if you're an investor, you just wonder whether half the Tory party has sort of disappeared into the political upside down, because you just think, well, there's going to be 2 more years of this, ignore the CBI on the shortage occupations list, ignore the CBI on regulatory alignment and where we need to be to deliver that to stuff. And so, it really is quite a bifurcated approach, I think, on Brexit, and how much space Rishi Sunak would have to be any saner. You know, to your point that only a third of the party would support him. Well, Theresa May and Boris Johnson didn't make too much of a good fist of that, did they?
So would if we talked about Rishi Sunak being sort of sensible, I suppose, but if he should win, how constrained would he be by this? I mean, would it completely tie his hands behind his back, or would he have the strength by being voted in to be able to stand up to this right wing of the party, the Frostian wing, as Peter might call it?
Well, like all prime ministers have a honeymoon period where they have a certain amount of autonomy, and if he's wise, would use that political capital early on, because it will seep away very quickly because of the inherent divisions we've just been discussing. I think, you know, if it were to be Sunak as the new leader, and we've all picked this up, I'm sure, from European EU contacts, there would be an opening for a new dialogue and a more constructive relationship. And I'm sure the EU would certainly want to explore the possibility that Sunak might be able to come up with some sensible proposals to sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol issue, which is obviously the main thing that's bedeviling the relationship, possibly around a sort of a veterinary deal being part of it, some sort of grand bargain where Sunak drops the controversial legislation that's going through Parliament at the moment. In exchange, they go for the green channels and the red channels. They have a veterinary deal, Horizon 2020 that Peter mentions. You could have some sort of grand package there. I'm sure the EU would like to try and work with Sunak if possible. If Sunak's not able to deliver it, the things that Peter was just describing are now exactly what Keir Starmer says he'll do if Labour win the next election. All those things, the mobility chapter, the veterinary deal, Horizon, all that, and basically just trying to soften the edges of Brexit.
And Shona, I think you were going to ask what business want here.
Yeah.
Business want certainty. Business want moving past discussions on the Northern Ireland Protocol. There's stuff here that we can actually do. Horizon 2020 is a really good example. It helps the UK be a global science superpower. There are things that we want to be having conversations about. So it's about getting back round the table, finding a way through.
I think we need to look at the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we've all been mentioning, and we haven't talked about the legislation that's going through Parliament right now to rip it up. And Peter, can you explain, for those of us who aren't Brexit nerds, a little bit more about how the Northern Ireland Protocol works and what the new bill will do?
So we all remember what we're going to do about Northern Ireland if there's a border in between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. When we left the EU, that becomes an external trade border, but politically you can't put that border back. So the question is, where do you put the border? If it's not north-south, you have to have it in the Irish Sea. So that was essentially the Northern Irish Protocol, which was an agreement that Northern Ireland would follow EU rules for goods, essentially. And because we did a very minimalist Brexit deal that I was talking about, that border gets higher and higher. Because if we'd done the kind of high alignment deal that Theresa May was talking about, with veterinary deal, and we were part of the customs union, then loads of the checks that have upset everybody would go away. Now, the British government says that border is disrupting the politics of Northern Ireland. The unionist parties, all of them, reject that border. They say it's taking them away from their natural place in the United Kingdom single market, and is politically unworkable. Liz Truss, when she became Foreign Secretary and took over that file, initially started a discussion actually about how we were going to fix it. Let's reduce that border friction, talk about these red-green channels that George mentioned, so that any good that's only going definitely to Northern Ireland, there's no risk of it going into the south, say something that's going to a supermarket already known for sale, and that wouldn't need any checks. So we'd immediately start lowering the border. And essentially that kind of broke down quite quickly. And so the government now, under pressure from the ERG, from the right of the party, have essentially tabled a piece of legislation that would allow them to gut the protocol. So remove the checks, remove the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, the apex court of the EU, over Northern Ireland, which you have to have because it follows EU rules. Annex 5 of the protocol is the entire EU acquis that covers EU goods. So, you know, that's their rules. So their court, right? So that goes away. The bit on state aid, Article 10 of the protocol, which says that any decision that might impact subsidy control decisions for goods in Northern Ireland would have to be referred to the court. That goes away. And then in its place, there's a sort of entirely trust-based honesty box system and a single rate for tax, and then a kind of dual regulatory environment where basically you can have any goods for EU rules or UK rules all flying around at the same time, and basically enforcement would fix it. So essentially they're gutting the protocol. They're not trying to smooth it around the edges, share it down. They're just unilaterally gutting it. But the international obligations are still there, right? So the government, it says it's got this doctrine of necessity where it has to save Northern Ireland and save the protocol. But the trouble is, to do that, it has to prove that, or has to show that all avenues have been explored. But they haven't even used Article 16, which is the kind of safeguards clause in the treaty. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the government is putting something on the table that is essentially ripping up a treaty that was the gateway to the trade agreement. Remember all that stuff about we're not going to have a trade deal until we've sorted the Northern Ireland problem. So we sorted it, we did the trade deal, and now you're ripping it up. And that is why the European Commission, Brussels, Paris, Berlin are so adamant that the Brits will get nothing if they take this unilateral approach. And if they carry on with this legislation, I think you will see, really quite market moving and draconian threats coming out of Brussels, including the threat to suspend the TCA entirely.
So do we think the legislation is going to be enacted? George, what do you think?
I think the expectation is that it will go through its common stages next week. I think it's still the plan. Then it goes into the House of Lords in the autumn, where we're expecting much more rigorous opposition. House of Lords packed with Europhiles, former diplomats, former ambassadors. But possibly, we're all picking up signals, aren't we, that the Lords won't in the end resist to the bitter end. So this bill could go onto the statute book by the autumn. It's interesting that all of the candidates in this contest have committed to continuing with the protocol bill. People like Sunak will say he can use it as leverage in a negotiation with the EU, sort of there on the table in the background. But even privately in meetings, I'm told that Sunak is still committing to the protocol. I think probably people on the pro-European wing of the Tory party think that if Sunak were elected, there would be a much more rational, and a lot of the tension will be taken out of the argument, because basically there's a total lack of trust. Boris Johnson is regarded by President Macron as somebody who's not serious and can't be trusted. Take Johnson out of the equation, you at least create better atmospherics, I think.
That depends on who wins, though, no?
And I think there has to be an opportunity, because Steve and I were discussing this before we came on air. This legislation has these 4 big, as it were, kind of slashes to the protocol on the face of the bill, as it were. So there's a clause 15 which gives them kind of sweeping power to do other stuff. But once that legislation becomes law, as I understand it, it kind of takes effect. So they're not just putting the gun on the table. The gun goes off. The planes are in the air. And so if this is going to be fixed before that happens, there's going to have to be a moment, which presumably there will be. It may be trickier with Truss because she's so much the architect of the legislation, where before all that happens, new prime minister, let's have a reset. We have been here before. Remember, Truss went to Chevening with Sefcovic and they had this big la-di-da reset. But these are very intractable issues. But somehow, I think there is genuine concern. We've got a big fight, obviously, with Ukraine, with Russia. Do we really want a Brussels-London split? So I do think there will be a big effort to put enough on the table so that whoever is leader, they can justify moving on. Because presumably, as we head into this cost of living crisis, even the ERG doesn't really want a trade war with Brussels.
You would think not. Actually, one of the things that's coming out of this contest, that we all know that Number 10 and Boris Johnson's allies are briefing ferociously against Rishi Sunak. One of the things they're saying is that Sunak was opposed to the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. And we've reported that, haven't we? That he was very anxious about the economic impacts of this. Look, I mean, the truth is, if President Macron had a vote, or Ursula von der Leyen had a vote in Brussels, there's no doubt out of the front runners in this contest, they'd be voting for Rishi Sunak, without a doubt.
One of our viewers has just asked, will the issues surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol be the downfall of the next Prime Minister? It's quite a good question. He wants to take a punt. Go on, Stephen.
So I think one of the things we haven't sort of really touched on is that on the 5th of September, whoever is elected, the first thing they'll have to do is form a cabinet, and they will be in this fairly weak position, and they will be having conversations with other people about what would cause them to want to serve. And I think actually we'll take our whole programme, sit down and try and fill a whole government. If we tried to do it with some people, because some people use that moment to go, we can't go ahead with the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. Some people will say we have to go ahead with the Northern Ireland Protocol bill. It's not clear to me how the Tory party can move forward without having to face both ways. We obviously will be, the energy price cap will have come up again. We'll have all sorts of other problems. It feels, I think it's likely that the Northern Ireland Protocol will be this continual destabilising influence within the Conservative Party, again, regardless of which one of the three emerges as leader.
Well, I hesitate to say this, given how much we all love talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol and indeed Brexit, but I suspect the fate of the next Prime Minister will be decided by other things, notwithstanding how important this is as an issue.
Simon, I haven't forgotten you, but I know this is a difficult one. But obviously, a trade war would be extremely bad for business and investment and just about everything else. So that your members would be concerned about.
Exactly, it's uncertainty. Anything that causes uncertainty impacts investment. And if we're talking about the kind of investment we need to bring into the UK that's going to shift the dial on growth, it's not a 3-month investment cycle. It's not a 6. This is long-term stuff we want to bring into the UK, and it's long-term stuff we want to grow. We want to innovate. We want to bring in new skills. We want to develop things in the UK. And we want to lead the way on a whole bunch of different things. And these are on long-term cycles, and uncertainty has impact on that.
And I mean, to George's point, we like to talk about the protocol, but the reason we like talking about the protocol is not because it's my hobby horse. It's because actually it is poisoning and freezing relations with the EU. And to Simon's point about investment, when you talk to the trade associations that represent Spanish or Latin American or US businesses that operate in the UK, the thing they will tell you that is damaging the investment prospects of the UK is the fact that our relations with the EU are at a standstill. Most of our manufacturing, most of our services, they're intermediate, they're interlocked with the European Union. And so if we want to fix that investment piece, a big part of that is normalizing our relations with Europe, which is our neighborhood. 43% of our exports go to Europe, right? And so although it's not, the Northern Ireland situation needs fixing, right? The problem is doing it unilaterally in a way that provokes the European Union, and not just by this is not just mad Brussels. You talk to people in Berlin, the German government, the people who were supposed to remember saving us with the BMWs, are absolutely furious. They're livid. And I think that's why we've got to try and draw the poison out of this. And one of the difficulties is that I think from the DUP perspective, the union's perspective, it is also operational. Let's get this border down, low friction. Let's not make it difficult for UK companies, GB companies, rather, to export to NI. Let's make it operationally effective. But the other 3 bits of that protocol bill are for the ERG, right? They are ideological objections to the European Court of Justice having any jurisdiction over a part of the United Kingdom. Well, that's the deal that Johnson signed, so they could have their hard Brexit. There's the stuff on BAT, single tax regime for Northern. Well, sorry, but that's if you want your buccaneering super hard Brexit, that's the consequence. And so the problem is going to be trying to separate out that bit which is being driven by the ERG with the practical requirements of fixing it for the people of Northern Ireland.
Presumably it's not just the Northern Ireland. There's also other issues on divergence of regulation and the bonfire of the regulations, etc., which we've all written in the FT about how unrealistic those are as well. And
those go back to, again, a bit like the kind of these sort of slightly simplest myths. The Ian Duncan Smith was commissioned to write this Tigger report. This belief that if you can cut EU regulation that now is retained EU law, it will lead to a productivity boost. The thing is that when business gets asked, what do you want to cut? They say, well, not much really, right? If we make medical devices or pharmaceuticals or chemicals, etc., we need to be fundamentally aligned with the EU. If you go back before Brexit, David Cameron commissioned the Balance of Competence Review, 15 volumes, none of which really saw the light of day, because after all the departments,
that when I was in government, so
all the departments, went round it, and guess what? They didn't really come up with much, and so there's this myth, that the civil service has been captured by years in the EU, and if we could just get rid of EU law, we'd all be buccaneering, and but that's actually not what industry says.
What do your members say around this?
I think there's I would agree with some of that, right? It's going to sound like an absolute broken record here, and you guys can start playing bingo on how many times I say growth and uncertainty. But things that make a future scenario uncertain are things that are tricky. But at the same time, there are prizes, right? There are places where the UK can lead the way on pharmaceuticals, on AI, new technology, and things like that. There are opportunities, but you do still need to move past where we are. I think that's the key thing here. You've got to move past where we are so you can start having conversations about what the future looks like. And whilst we're still, if we remain stuck where we are, we won't be able to have those conversations about the future.
The one area I should say where the government is currently very focused on in terms of maximising Brexit opportunities as they would see them is in City of London regulation, and next week's going to be quite important for that. There's going to be a Mansion House speech, big financial services speech by the new Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi, I think it's on Tuesday, and then the publication of a financial services bill on Wednesday. And this is all about essentially relaxing regulations in the City of London to make the city more competitive, as the government would see it, and to promote growth. Now, the problem with that is that the Bank of England's not particularly happy about what they're being asked to do. It's an independent regulator, and they're worried that what Boris Johnson wants to do, deregulating the city, is to expose the city and policyholders, insurance, pensioners to unacceptable risk. And there's a huge argument going on there. So are we going to use some of our Brexit freedoms to undermine some of the regulation that was put in place after the 2008 crash?
More uncertainty for business in that case, and for the rest of us, by the sounds of it. Brexit kind of is omnipresent, but there's other policies that the candidates have said little on, or a few things on. One of them is the government's net zero pledge. There's not a massive enthusiasm that I'm hearing. I don't know if if politically, if it's considered a liability for the Conservatives have had this as their pledge since 2019. Stephen?
I think the interesting thing is that broadly in 2019, in order to get that majority, Boris Johnson used his credibility on the right of the party to move the Conservatives towards the centre on a whole swathe of issues. Big pledges on, police, schools, hospitals, and on climate. And this is one of the things which frustrates a lot of Conservative MPs. They have this big majority, but they can't do very much with it because they've got these spending pledges which force them to a certain place on tax, force them to a certain place on this, that, and the other. And I think one of the sort of psychological dynamics we're seeing is that the climate target is the thing which feels like the thing you can pull back from. But actually already in this leadership election, partly because of the sort of very impressive actually campaigning efforts of an MP called Chris Skidmore and the Conservative peer Zach Goldsmith, but they have managed to pull quite a lot of the candidates towards a rhetorical commitment to it. I mean, I don't know about you, George, but I would not have expected at the start of this contest that all of them would have actually come around to saying, yes, I'll keep it. Now, whether or not they'll be committed to it in the same sense that British governments are committed to, say, reforming planning, where they talk a lot about but never do it, is quite another. But they have had to move quite a long way in this leadership election.
I agree with that. I think Kemi Badenoch's probably the only one who's questioned it at all. Isn't that right?
And then she sort of appeared to
U-turn. She retreated a bit on that. I think it's one of the big differences between, when we often see Boris Johnson as a right-wing populist, one of the big distinctions between him and other right-wing populists is his position on climate change. And it's to his credit that he's stuck to it. And I think also that's partly to do with the fact, I don't know whether you agree with this, Simon, that they see the green agenda as being part of the innovation and growth agenda.
That's exactly what I was going to come in with. It's like, if the climate crisis wasn't enough, there is a lot of money and a lot of innovation and a lot of way that the UK can lead. So we've already got a really good offshore wind sector. We're really doing well on that one. You've got a lot of traditional manufacturing sectors that are at this inflection point. You've got to move away from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, right? And that's battery technology. In aviation, it's sustainable aviation fuels. There's loads and loads of examples of prizes where the UK can, with the right environment, the right tax environment, the right R&D environment, and the right skills, they can really seize those prizes. If the government sets up those three things, business will do the rest. And that'll bring in a lot of jobs, a lot of growth. So there's a massive opportunity here if the rest of it wasn't enough to motivate you.
Yeah, I mean, the politics are still tricky, aren't they? When you talk about who's going to shoulder the cost of retrofitting houses,
energy efficiency.
You try and buy an electric car for less than 40 grand, you can't. And actually, the tax breaks all go to people who have electric cars because they're much cheaper to run. But the Treasury doesn't want to bite the bullet on road pricing because £70 billion worth of tax is going to disappear when we're no longer paying fuel duty. You can see the political record is actually not that good, is it, when it comes to making toughish decisions that land on people? I mean, isn't that where the right, probably feels that they're going to have to work hard to make the agenda stick when people start having to pay for it.
I've got a viewer question here. Does the panel expect a significant shift in policy areas such as education and skills and levelling up? We haven't really talked about levelling up. This is one of Boris Johnson's key policies. You've mentioned it slightly, Peter, by talking about sort of where you called it dollops of money that were ill-targeted. But this is a bit massive issue.
So one of the things that came out of that excellent Stagnation Nation report, the Resolution Foundation did, which I recommend reading, is how relatively tough things are for the bottom 20% of people in this country, and how actually compared to the poorest 20% of families in the state in Germany or France, in the UK you are 20% poorer in real terms. And one of the huge gaps is skills, and actually the lifelong learning entitlement is one of the best policies, right? So you have a chunk of money over your lifetime that allows you to go and get skills. But again, that is actually a great policy, but it needs help for implementation. So who's going to do the childcare while you're going off to do your night school qualification? And how do you actually access the money? What's the incentive for businesses to engage with FE colleges to actually, find what skills they need and get people on these courses and get them? And that kind of joined upness, that's where the levelling up's actually really going to come from. And I think one of the really sad things, funnily enough, about the Boris Johnson era is he got we had this awful fight over Brexit, better or for worse, bad luck Northern Ireland, but we got Brexit done. We got a prime minister finally with a stable majority, having had a coalition, and Theresa May limping along with the DUP and confidence supply, 80-seat majority, and an agenda in levelling up that actually could have got a lot of people feeling better about politics. When you go and interview people, they're all as bad as each other. No one can do anything for me. The managerial class have failed us. And the danger is we're going to go through another political cycle where we fail again, where people feel actually another big chat about levelling up, give it another name. And, and I really hope that, we can get to a world where we start to actually deliver some of this stuff.
When you step back and think about what Peter just said there, you realise what a fragile electoral proposition the Conservative Party is putting together for the next election. You're basically relying on a load of seats in the North and the Midlands, appreciating what Boris has done in terms of levelling up since the 2019, making good on those promises, and a load of seats where for generations people haven't voted Conservative. At the same time, you're losing metropolitan, liberal, better off parts of the South. And then you've got parts of the Southwest which have voted Tory solidly for years, where they're now starting to hear the words levelling up and they think the Tories are taking us for granted. It's all about the North. And we saw that with the Tiverton and Holliston by-election recently. I mean, it's unless you actually start to make good, as Peter said, people become disillusioned, not just with politics, but with the Conservative government in particular.
And levelling up became a north-south thing. But actually there are loads of boroughs in London that need levelling up, right? Yeah. Loads of bits of Cornwall. Cornwall was the biggest recipient of EU structural funds because it has some of the poorest boroughs and places in the country. But because they turned levelling up into a north-south thing, it ended up looking like a selfish Tory thing, because that's what our electoral coalition needs, because we need to hang on to all these new seats we won in the north. But actually levelling up as a concept has to be, about spatial economic inequalities that aren't geographic, or not always geographic.
Part of the problem is that the party is sort of divided between, some people use levelling up to mean let's make all of our cities as productive as Lyon, and half thinks, oh, that means that my constituents stop being angry about potholes, the fact that there are never any police on the street. And now obviously that latter is much more important for winning the next election. But if you're not doing the former, then you don't have any of the tax revenue to do any of the latter. And I think the underlying problem is that I anticipate that whoever wins this election's budget will run into some kind of trouble, because the reason why they've ended up with these high taxes is, you say to a Conservative MP, oh, you want high taxes? They go, no. You're okay, well, I'm going to cut your rec centre, and a bit falls off the budget. And that has basically been the story of every fiscal event since the 2015 general election. And the challenge has been, how do you get out of that cycle? And it doesn't feel that we've seen anything from any of the candidates to suggest that they can.
And these guys covered the levelling up, so I can cover the skills if you like.
Yes.
Skills part of that question. Workforce pressures and available skills are one of the things that consistently comes up as one of the biggest things that business are worried about. If you think about the prizes that I was talking about, they exist in every sector, but you've got to have the skills in order to take advantage of those. And you talked about lifelong learning entitlement and building on that apprenticeship level. You've got to flex it. You have to have flexibility there, because it's got to, you want to use it for people who are building combustion engines right now, they want to be building electric engines. How do you retrain those people to take advantage of the future economic
Simon,
crisis?
why is it that British companies, the Chancellor said this to you at your annual dinner, I was there and I listened, British companies invest much, and I genuinely don't know the answers, much less than French or German companies, don't they, in training, in skills,
Yeah,
etc.
so there has been a slight decrease in the amount of business investment in skills, and it actually maps really neatly with the government's decrease in investment and planning in skills. So, it's got to be a business and government partnership. As I was saying before, in the net zero, if government set the right policy and the right fiscal environment, business will do the rest. And I also think, there are challenges about getting the right skills, right? And where do you get them from? Where do they come from? If it takes a long time to sort that stuff out, they could have gone and got a job somewhere else. So the workforce pressures aren't just about skills. There are lots of other things that impact workforce pressures.
Well, related to that is also one of the other policy issues that all of the candidates appear to agree on, which is on immigration and certainly around asylum seekers. And that is also that's tied up with Brexit, but it's still an issue. There's a workforce list, a shortage occupation list, that there's different sectors. Well, you can talk to this, Saima, crying out for change to that, more flexibility. We touched on that at the beginning, but how big an issue is that? And is immigration considered to be a dirty word still in the leadership campaign? So we'll start with you, Saima.
I think one of the challenges around this is that workforce pressures are happening now, and some of the measures that people talk about to fix workforce pressures and visas and migration, they take a long time. And actually, there are pressures that are happening right now. And updating the shortage occupation list is absolutely one of the things that the government could be doing. We talked about this right at the beginning. They don't need to wait. They have that already exists. The powers, the ability to do that already exists. You don't need Parliament to be around to do that. You can do that. So I would recommend that one.
How optimistic are we that recommendation is going to be taken?
Yeah.
Yes, I think we'll turn to our political experts for that one.
The one thing I'd say about that is, I totally agree with what you said at the beginning, Sharon, that any candidate goes into this contest saying we're going to reverse the send migrants to Rwanda policy, killing their candidature straight off. But that was interesting at Rishi Sunak's launch. He said something interesting. He said that we need a new consensus on immigration, and he talked then about the need to bring the brightest and the best and the usual kind of thing. Well, I thought, well, that's interesting. He's actually saying we need a new consensus. If there's and I asked about it afterwards, and they said, I didn't mean anything by that, of course, But you got the impression, and whilst the Rwanda policy gives all of them, you have to pay, you have to pay allegiance to that policy. But Rishi Sunak, if he became Prime Minister, I think could stick to the Rwanda policy to give him cover to do more interesting stuff in terms of liberalising the regime in other parts of.
And the polling data doesn't. I'm pretty sure the polling data shows that the saliency of immigration as an issue.
Yeah.
And obviously you have to separate out the kind of little illegal immigration, small boats, and economic migration, free movement. But I think the saliency of that as an issue has diminished significantly.
Even though immigration levels are now higher than they were before Brexit, right? And to be fair, I suspect some of us around this table aren't necessarily enthusiastic Brexiteers, but it is true that actually the Brexit referendum did draw the stinger because it did establish that we had control over the borders. And once people felt that we had control, they seemed to turn a complete blind eye to the fact we were actually had more people coming into the country, albeit not from the European Union.
So is it also an opportunity for the opposition? And what does Labour think about? Well, certainly, I think we know what they think about the Rwanda policy, but sort of more generally, have they signalled that they will change this, and will they try for to reinstate freedom of movement with Europe?
So,
which of course, is very complicated.
The Labour Party has had a long-term electoral headache about some of its now mostly former voters in ex-industrial areas about the free movement of people within the European Economic Area. And in many ways, the one thing the Labour Party likes about Brexit is that the electoral headache of having to defend free movement has been taken away from them. One of the reasons why Keir Starmer did his big Brexit speech going, free movement is not coming back, I'm not going back into the single market, is they do not want to have to talk about immigration at the next election. They want to be able to put it in a nice box so they can focus on the issues they tend to do well when they are high salience, high public services, cuts, etc., etc. But it does mean, they're obviously having a lot of joy at the moment with this, we're more credible on tax line they like to wheel out. But it does mean, then the question then gets asked, okay, well, do you want to get back into the single market? Because if you don't, that's 4% of economic activity you're sort of leaving on the table. And I do think one problem for Labour here is we are going to have a big debate about growth because we don't have enough of it. And that does force the conversation in a place they don't want it to be, which is revisiting the idea that maybe 2016 was a catastrophic mistake.
And a lot of economists will say, actually, the quickest way to surround the growth problem is to open the immigration taps. I'm not saying that we know where that led to the Brexit referendum, but actually, that's what a lot of economists will say would be the quickest fix in the short
businesses
term.
That you, in your association, does the CBI feel the same, or not you, but the businesses tell you that they think that's a good idea?
I think there is a general consensus that we need to take action on workforce and skills, because that is one of the things that is consistently raised. And there are a number of different ways that you do that. But, that would be skills and workforce are one of the levers to unlock investment, certainly.
Yeah.
Very diplomatic.
Stephen, the truth is, right, the Labour Party can't be any more truthful about Brexit than the Tory Party can. The brutal truth about Brexit is the choice is between self-harm, 4% of GDP in the long run, wages by the end of the decade, £470 less than they otherwise would have been, according to the Resolution Foundation. So you have self-harm, or what you could emotively call subjugation, right? Which is, Norway, pay into the budget, accept the rules, most of which you're going to accept anyway, because that's what industry wants. But you create an unsustainable political situation, which led to Brexit in the first place, which was Brussels tells us what to do. And we couldn't handle that when we were a member of the European Union. We were at the council every quarter. We were cherry-picked on justice and home affairs. We had rebates, we had opt-outs, and even then we couldn't handle it. So the idea that we could handle a Norway, it strikes me as deeply unrealistic politically. So we're in a bind. We're in a bind.
So are we optimistic about the next 2 years, let's say, and what is going to, the result of the leadership election and our next Prime Minister? Are they going to be able to solve any of these issues, or are they going to be dogged by them? Are we going to revisit them in the next election? What do you think, Stephen?
Yeah, I think, this Prime Minister, whoever it is going to need a mandate from the country in order to be able to unite the Tory party, or they'll need to be replaced by another party. So I think we are definitely in for 2 years of paralysis and uncertainty, whatever happens.
Is that your thinking too, George?
The economic outlook is so grim at the moment, to be honest, and the economic forces at play are beyond any government, let alone one that might be led by someone who doesn't have a massive grasp of economic policy. I think the next election is going to be fought in very difficult circumstances, and probably with unemployment starting to rise, inflation coming down but still high, people still feeling it's going to be, all elections are determined by economics usually. And so it's going to be I think that's going to be the defining issue. And I don't think the next 18 months or 2 years are going to clear the current dilemma out of the way.
Is that the message that you're hearing?
I think we are in extraordinary economic times. I am concerned about the people that this is impacting. This is impacting people every day, like real people who are over the summer going to be thinking about feeding their kids and buying them school shoes at the end of the summer holidays and all of that stuff. Energy prices going up again. That stuff also impacts business. Input costs are going up, whether that's energy prices or materials prices or whatever it is. Input costs are going up, and a lot of that is currently being absorbed. It's going to get harder, right? And I am more optimistic than you. You said no government can do anything about this. There are things that they can do. They can incentivize investment properly. They can have a skills agenda that brings in the right skills that we need in order to take advantage of these prizes. And we haven't, talked about R&D very much, but there is an opportunity here to incentivize and encourage R&D. And as I was saying before, you do those things, and business will help. Business will do the rest. Business will take advantage of that economic prizes, and then help lift the economy. That's how you lift the economy, is growth.
Well, that's, I think, an optimistic note on which to end our discussion, which I think has been fascinating, and I'm sure our viewers have too. And I'd like to thank George, Stephen, Peter and Simon, and thank you for watching.